The ground was telling a story, and Silas Grady knew how to read it. It was a story written in blood. The wind that morning whispered through the pines like a dying man's last confession. It was cold, too cold for autumn, and the ground was slick with something darker than dew. Silas had seen enough battlefields to know death's signature. He knew how blood curled at the edges when it dried, how it turned black as sin and clung to the earth like a secret that refused to be buried. He knelt in the brush, his old bones creaking in protest. His fingers, calloused from war and work, grazed the copper-colored trail. It snaked through the pine needles and over the cold stones, a faint but stubborn line. It wasn't an animal's trail. Animals bled differently. This was human, and it was fresh. Silas stood up, his breath a cloud of smoke in the frigid air. High above a hawk circled, a patient, feathered judge in a pale, unforgiving sky. His sorrel mare, tethered to a low branch, snorted nervously, her ears twitching. She sensed it too. They weren't alone. There wasn't much left inside Silas that you could call wonder. The man he used to be, the one who saw hope in a sunrise or beauty in a wildflower, had been left behind in the mud of Antietam. What was left of him was buried under a simple wooden cross next to his wife, Clara May. This feeling stirring in his gut wasn't curiosity. It was something colder, something familiar. It was recognition. A blood trail leading into the dark woods was a language he'd been forced to learn as a boy, a language he could never forget. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call out. He just followed it, his hand resting on the butt of the old revolver holstered at his hip. He'd lived on the edge of Ash Hollow for 7 years, a ghost in a crooked cabin with a leaning chimney. The folks in town, they didn't speak to him, not with kindness anyway. They'd nod, maybe, or spit on the ground near his boots when they thought he wasn't looking. Stories in a town like Ash Hollow grew taller than the pines, and his was the tallest of them all. Some said he'd killed Clara. Others whispered he'd just let her die in the fire that took their home. No one ever asked him for the truth. They preferred the stories they'd invented. And Silas, he never gave them a reason to question their lies. He carried their scorn like a shroud, a penance for a sin he didn't commit. But the blood trail, it didn't care about his name. It didn't care about the town's judgment. It only cared about where it was going. The trail was a ghost, disappearing and reappearing as it wound deeper into the forest. The woods grew thick, choking out the morning sun, casting long, skeletal shadows across his path. Silas moved with a predator's grace, his eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. Every nerve was stretched taut, an old rope about to snap. He was a man accustomed to waiting for the gunshot, for the scream in the dark. An hour passed, then another. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the fallen leaves. It was a silence that felt heavy, watchful. Even the birds had stopped singing, and that's when he saw it. It was a massive log, ancient and hollowed out by time, lying between two leaning pines as if it had fallen a century ago, just for this moment. The blood trail ended right at its dark, gaping mouth. The air grew still. The wind died. A feeling like cold water washed over Silas. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever was inside that log was still alive. He crouched low, his movements slow and deliberate, his body coiled like a spring. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer echoing unnaturally in the dead quiet. He didn't want to use it, but he wouldn't be caught unprepared. Not again. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Ain't here to hurt you." There was a flicker of movement from within the dark hollow, a tiny shift, slower than a fox, smaller than a deer. Silas held his breath, his finger steady on the trigger. He let the silence stretch, letting his presence become just another part of the woods. After a long, agonizing moment, a shape resolved itself in the shadows. It wasn't an animal. It was a child, a boy, no older than 10, rail-thin and covered in dirt and grime. He was curled into a tight ball, trying to make himself disappear. And then the boy's eyes caught the faint light. They were huge, too big for his gaunt face, ringed with dark circles of exhaustion and terror. But beneath the fear, there was something else, something that twisted Silas's gut into a knot. It was a knowing. This wasn't the first time this child had hidden from a monster. Silas slowly, carefully, holstered his weapon. He took off his worn leather coat, the familiar weight of small comfort. He held it out like a peace offering. "You cold?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. The boy just stared, his eyes tracking every tiny movement. "You hurt?" Silas tried again. The boy blinked, a slow, painful movement. His lips were cracked and bleeding. "Got a name?" And then the boy spoke. His voice was so faint, it was almost carried away by the wind that had just started to stir again. A single sentence, whispered with the absolute certainty of a death sentence. "He'll kill me if you tell." Silas froze. It wasn't the words themselves that stopped his heart. It was the way the boy said them. Not with a cry, not with a shout, but with the flat, emotionless finality of someone stating a fact. Like the sun rises in the east, like the river flows to the sea, like the man who did this will find him and finish the job. Silas didn't press him. He didn't ask who he was. He knew that pushing for answers now would only send the boy deeper into his shell of terror. Instead, he laid his coat down near the opening of the log. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the child. "Stay or come," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "I'll be just over that ridge. You're safe now, if you want to be." He turned and walked away, every instinct screaming at him to stay, to guard the boy. But he knew better. Trust wasn't something you could force. It was a fragile thing, a seed you planted and hoped would grow in the dark. That night, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the crooked windows of his cabin. Silas left a lantern burning low on the porch, a small beacon in the oppressive darkness. He left a thick wool blanket folded on the top step. He didn't go to the barn to check on the horses, though they stamped and whinnied restlessly. He just waited, sitting in Clara's old rocking chair, the one he hadn't had the heart to get rid of. He sat in the dark, the scent of pine and rain wrapping around him like a familiar ghost, and he listened. By dawn, the blanket was gone. He found the boy asleep in the hayloft of his barn, curled up against a sack of oats like a stray puppy seeking warmth. His coat was draped over the boy's small, shivering frame. One of his barn cats, a scarred old tomcat named Patches, was curled up beside him, purring like a tiny engine. It was as if the old cat had appointed himself guardian. Silas didn't wake him. He moved about his morning chores with a quiet purpose he hadn't felt in years. He fed the chickens, their clucking a welcome sound in the tense silence. He watered the horses, their warm breath fogging in the crisp morning air. He mended a section of fence damaged by a recent storm. He worked with his hands, letting the familiar rhythm of the labor calm the storm inside him. He didn't speak a word, but he left an enamel cup of fresh milk and a warm biscuit on the bottom rung of the loft ladder. When he returned at noon, they were gone. For 3 days the boy lived in the barn. He never spoke another word. He jumped at every creak of the barn door, his eyes wide with a hunted look that never quite faded. But he didn't run. And in Silas's world, that meant everything. Silas started calling him Zeke. It just felt right. Short, strong, a name that felt like it could withstand a storm. The boy never confirmed if it was his real name, but he didn't deny it either. He just accepted it, another small piece of a new life he was tentatively building. The town didn't know about the boy yet, and that's how Silas wanted it. Ash Hollow wasn't a place where secrets were kept. It was a place where they were weaponized. People didn't ask questions to learn the truth. They asked questions to confirm the ugly answers they had already decided on. Silas hadn't set foot in town since Clara's funeral. They'd buried her in the forgotten corner of the churchyard, where the fence sagged and the weeds grew tall. Judge Ransom, the most powerful man in the county, had paid for her headstone, a grand marble affair that seemed out of place among the simple wooden crosses. Folks in town said it was a gesture of kindness. Silas knew it was a gesture of guilt. The judge's son, Luther, still walked the streets of Ash Hollow like he owned them. He was all polished boots and expensive clothes, with a silver ring on his finger that always seemed to catch the light and a smile that never, ever reached his cold, dead eyes. He'd been there the day Clara died. He'd been there at the house just before the fire started. But that was a story Silas had learned to keep locked away. No one believed him. They just looked at him with that familiar mixture of pity and suspicion, their minds already made up. It was nearly 2 weeks before Zeke spoke again. It was evening, and the air was thick with the smell of coming rain. Silas was patching a hole in the chicken coop, his hands moving with practiced ease. Zeke sat nearby, tracing patterns in the dirt with a broken stick. "Do you believe in hell?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Silas stopped hammering. He looked over at the boy, his small frame silhouetted against the dying sun. "I've seen enough of it to know it's real," he answered quietly. Zeke nodded, as if that was the only answer that made sense. "My mama's there," he said, his voice cracking. "I think." Silas put down his hammer and walked over to the boy. He sat down in the dirt beside him. "What makes you say that?" he asked gently. She didn't stop him. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Silas didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, a silent witness to the boy's pain. Then he spoke, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Maybe she couldn't," he said. "Maybe she was just trying to survive. Same as you." Zeke didn't answer. He just dropped the stick and wiped his hands on his pants, as if trying to scrub away a stain no one else could see. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a dam breaking, like something heavy he'd been carrying for a long, long time had finally been set down. That night, Silas found a pine cone on his porch rail. It was rough and misshapen, but someone had tied a piece of twine around it, as if to mark it as important, as if it were a gift. He didn't ask where it came from. He just took it inside and placed it on the windowsill, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile truce being forged between two broken souls. The boy started to talk more after that, not about the man with the silver ring, not about the bruises that were slowly fading on his ribs. He asked about the horses. He asked about the barn cat. He asked why the rooster crowed so damn early every morning. And Silas, for the first time in 7 years, found himself wanting to answer. He found himself wanting to talk, to share the small, simple truths of his solitary life. But the nights were still long and dark. Zeke would often wake up screaming, his hands clawing at the straw in the hayloft as if he were trying to escape a fire. Silas never rushed to him. He'd learned from the war that you don't smother a wound. You give it air. You let the fear bleed out. He'd climb the ladder and sit a few feet away, a silent sentinel in the dark, holding a tin cup of water. Zeke would eventually calm down, his ragged breaths slowly evening out. He would take the cup from Silas, his small hands always shaking, and drink. They would sit there in the quiet darkness of the barn, two ghosts sharing a space, until the first rays of dawn painted the sky. A month after the boy arrived, Silas built a second bed in the loft. It was a simple cot, just a wooden frame with a straw mattress and a clean, patched blanket. But when Zeke saw it, he just stood there, his hand resting on the ladder, his eyes wide. He stared at it for a long time, not saying a word. Then in a voice so quiet Silas almost missed it, he whispered a single, heartbreaking sentence. He said I'd never sleep safe again. Silas didn't look at him. He just kept working, his hands tightening on the hammer. "He was wrong," he said, his voice a low growl. The next morning Zeke was gone. The cot was still perfectly made. The pine cone was still on the windowsill. But the boy, the fragile ghost who had started to feel like a part of the quiet rhythm of his life, had vanished. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, just an empty space in the hayloft and a silence that was heavier, more profound than any he had ever known. A silence that felt like a fresh wound. Silas didn't waste time on anger or despair. He saddled his mare, his movements swift and sure. He rode out past the ridge, back towards the dark woods where the blood trail had first begun. He had to know. He had to find him. And that's when he saw it. Another mark on the damp earth. Faint but unmistakable. Blood. A single dark drop. Small and fresh. It led back towards Ash Hollow. Back towards the town. Back towards the monster. Zeke wasn't running away from him. He was running towards something. Something unfinished. Something that had to be faced. Silas spurred his mare, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The boy was going back to confront the devil. And Silas, a man who had long ago given up on salvation, knew he had to follow. He had to stand between the child and the fire. The sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky when Silas found him. He was huddled by the creek that marked the edge of town, half hidden behind a cluster of ferns and moss-covered rocks. Zeke had his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes fixed on the rushing water as if it held all the answers to the questions he was too afraid to ask. He didn't look up when Silas dismounted and approached, his boots silent on the soft earth. He didn't even flinch. For Zeke, that was progress. Silas crouched beside him, the cold seeping into his old bones. He didn't speak. He just waited, letting the silence and the sound of the creek do the work. The boy had fresh scratches on his face and mud on his hands. He was breathing, though. Steady, no tears. Just a heavy stillness, a coiled tension that spoke of a decision made. "I ain't mad," Silas said finally, his voice a low rumble. Zeke didn't answer. He just picked at a loose thread on his worn trousers, his shoulders hunched. "You didn't steal. You didn't lie. You just needed to be gone for a bit. I get that." "I thought about running," Zeke mumbled, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the gurgle of the water. "For good this time." Silas nodded, his eyes on the current. "Thought about it myself, more times than I can count." "I got halfway to town and I turned back," the boy whispered. "Don't know why." Silas looked at him then, a flicker of something warm in his weary eyes. Sometimes the heart knows things the mind can't explain. Zeke shrugged, but a fraction of the tension left his small body. The wound was still there, raw and deep, but for the first time, it looked like it might, just might, start to heal. They walked back to the cabin slowly, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. Zeke didn't say another word, but he didn't lag behind. He walked beside Silas, matching his stride. When they reached the cabin, Silas handed him the bucket of oats for the horses. It was heavy, and it took both the boy's hands to carry it, but he didn't complain. He carried it into the barn, his back straight, his steps sure. That evening, the pine cone was back on the windowsill. The piece of twine had been retied, tighter this time. The next day, the world came knocking. Marshal Boone rode up around noon, his horse stamping impatiently in the dirt. Boone was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat. He tipped his hat, his badge glinting in the midday sun like a warning. "Grady," he said, his voice flat, "heard you've been spending time out near the South Ridge." Silas leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't invite the marshal to sit. "That a crime now, Boone?" "Depends what you found." Silas's gaze was steady, unblinking. "Just trees, and quiet." Boone clicked his tongue, his eyes scanning past Silas toward the barn. From the shadows of the open barn door, Silas could see the faint outline of Zeke, still as a frightened deer. "You happen to see a boy out this way? Small for his age? Dark hair?" Silas didn't even turn his head. He could feel the boy's terror like a physical presence. "Ain't seen no child," he lied, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Judge Ransom's grandson has gone missing," Boone continued, his eyes narrowed, searching Silas's face for any flicker of deceit. "His son, Luther, says the boy ran off a few weeks back. Says he's got a wild imagination. A liar. Not the kind to survive long on his own." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The judge. Luther. It was all a lie. A carefully constructed story to cover up something monstrous. "Sorry to hear it," Silas said, his voice a low growl. Boone studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally he sighed and shifted in his saddle. "Well, if you do see him, you let me know. There's concern. The judge, he don't like loose ends." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And he still remembers what happened to Clara. A name that always seems to lead back to your door, Grady." It was a threat, plain and simple. Boone rode off, but he kept glancing back, his suspicion a palpable thing that hung in the air long after he was gone. That night, the storm inside Zeke finally broke. Silas found him curled up in the hayloft, his body rigid with a terror that was bone deep. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering lantern light like shattered glass. Silas sat on the ladder, his usual spot, and waited. "He ain't my grandpa," Zeke whispered into the darkness. Silas didn't ask who. He just waited. "My mommy. She used to clean their house. The judge's place. The words came out in a torrent, a flood of memories that had been dammed up for too long. They'd make her stay late. Luther. He was always there. I'd have to wait for her. Sleep under the porch sometimes. One night I woke up, and she was crying. He was still in the house. Silas closed his eyes, the image searing itself into his mind. The boy didn't need to be prodded. He needed the space to let the poison out. I told her I didn't like him. The man with the silver ring. She told me to never, ever say that again. She said he'd ruin us. Zeke's voice cracked, a dry sob catching in his throat. After that, she was different. Always tired. She'd flinch if I touched her. And then, one day, she just didn't wake up. The barn creaked around them, the sound of old wood groaning in the wind. The doctor said her heart just stopped, but I knew. I knew it was him. I hid for 2 days after she was gone. He found me. He smiled. That smile that ain't a smile. And he said he'd find me wherever I went. He said no one would ever believe a trashed child over a ransom. The fire that had been smoldering in Silas's gut for 7 long years roared back to life. He wanted to ride into town, to drag Luther Ransom out into the street and see justice done with his own 2 hands. But he looked at the trembling boy in the hayloft, and he knew that rage was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. He took a deep breath, forcing the fire down. You ain't trash, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. You're the bravest damn thing I've ever seen. Zeke didn't answer, but in the dim light, Silas saw the boy's small hand shift, inching closer to his worn leather boot, as if just needing to be near something solid, something real. A fragile alliance was forged in the darkness of that barn, an unspoken promise between a man who had lost everything and a boy who had never had anything to lose. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Zeke started helping around the homestead, small things at first. He hauled buckets of water from the well, his small arms straining. He scattered feed for the chickens, his movements tentative but determined. He swept the porch, his brow furrowed in concentration. Silas never asked him to do any of it. He just made the space, and the boy, slowly, tentatively, began to fill it. One afternoon, Silas was on the roof, patching a leak, when he looked down and saw Zeke in the yard below. The boy was sketching in the dirt with a stick, his focus absolute. He was drawing horses, and he was good. The lines were strong, confident. He had a gift for capturing their movement, their spirit. Silas climbed down and knelt beside him. He asked Zeke about the drawings, and for the very first time since he'd arrived, a genuine smile touched the boy's lips. Used to draw on the walls when Mama was working, he said, his voice soft. She said I could be a real painter one day, if I just stayed quiet. You don't have to stay quiet anymore, Silas said, his voice firm. That night, Silas climbed into the dusty attic of his cabin. He came back down with a small wooden box. He set it on the table in front of Zeke without a word. It was Clara's, her box of paints and brushes. They hadn't been touched since the day she died. Zeke stared at the box as if it were a holy relic. He opened it slowly, reverently. He picked up a brush, the bristles stiff with age, and held it in his hand, his eyes shining with a light Silas hadn't seen before. It was the light of hope. 3 days later, that hope was nearly extinguished. A black carriage, gleaming and sinister, rolled up the long dirt track to the cabin. A man with a face like stone held the reins. Luther Ransom stepped out first, his familiar poisonous grin already in place. Then the judge himself emerged. He was tall and rigid, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and ice. Mr. Grady, the judge said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. He didn't wait to be invited closer. We're looking for a boy, my grandson, a dangerous, delusional child. He stole from my family and ran. Silas didn't move from his spot on the porch, his body a silent, unyielding barrier. And you think I'm the kind of man to harbor a thief? You're the kind of man who keeps to himself, the judge countered, his eyes like chips of flint. That makes you a blank page, difficult to read. I like it that way. Luther stepped forward, his hand resting on his hip, close to the pistol Silas knew was holstered there. He tapped his silver ring against his belt buckle, a nervous, predatory gesture. He's a liar, Silas. The boy has a wild imagination. Said he saw me. Said I heard his mother. Can you believe that? Silas's eyes locked onto Luther's. I believe what I see, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The judge's thin lips twisted into a semblance of a smile. Then I suggest you watch what you see very carefully. They left without another word, their silent threat hanging in the air like smoke. Zeke had been hidden in the hayloft, concealed beneath an old tarp, clutching a pencil so tightly it had snapped in two. When Silas climbed up to him, the boy was trembling, his face pale. Are they going to take me? He whispered. Not while I'm still breathing, Silas vowed. Later that day, Silas found a new drawing on his pillow. It was a picture of a tall pine tree. A man and a horse stood beneath it, and high up in the branches, almost hidden from view, a small boy sat, watching over them. That night, the bullet tore through the barn wall. It splintered the old wood just inches from where Zeke was sleeping. No one was hit, but the message was as clear as a gunshot in the dead of night. They knew, and they were coming. Silas didn't even consider going to Marshall Boone. The law in Ash Hollow was a tool of the Ransoms, nothing more. He was on his own. They were on their own. He spent the next day fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the windows, reinforced the doors, and double-barred them from the inside. He dug out his old army rifle, the one he hadn't touched in years, and cleaned it with slow, deliberate movements. Zeke watched him, his eyes wide and solemn. Will they kill us? The boy asked, his voice small. Silas looked up from the rifle, his hands still. They'll try to scare us, he said. They'll try to make us feel small alone, but I ain't afraid of men who hide behind their money and their name. Zeke frowned, his small face a mask of worry. I am. You don't have to be, Silas said, his voice softer now. Not anymore. Not alone. From that night on, Zeke slept inside the main cabin. Silas set up Clara's old cot in the corner. The boy never thanked him in words, but he placed the small, twine-wrapped pine cone on the floor beside it. A silent offering, a symbol of his trust. Silas knew they couldn't hide forever. The Ransoms wouldn't stop until they had the boy, until their secret was buried for good. He also knew that the town would never help him. They had already judged him once, but not everyone in Ash Hollow was blind. There were cracks in the wall of silence, small fissures where the light could still get through. One of those cracks was Maeve, the widow who ran the general store. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman, but she had a good heart. She had been Clara's friend. When Silas rode into town for supplies, Maeve looked at him, her eyes missing nothing. You've got that look again, she said, her voice low. What look is that? The look of a man who's finally found something to lose. He didn't deny it. Before he left, she pressed a jar of her homemade peach preserves into his hand. For the boy, she whispered, her eyes full of a silent understanding. No charge. Zeke ate the entire jar in 2 days. The next morning, Silas found another painting left on the porch railing. It was crude, the lines wobbly, but the image was powerful. 2 figures, a man and a boy, stood side by side in front of a barn. A scruffy cat was curled at their feet, and above them, written in shaky letters, were 3 simple words: We don't run. Silas stared at the painting for a long time, a lump forming in his throat. Zeke came and stood beside him, silent. You ready to stop hiding? Silas asked, his voice rough. Zeke just nodded once, a single decisive gesture, and in that moment, with the morning sun casting long shadows across the yard, Silas knew what he had to do. They couldn't win this fight by cowering in the shadows. They had to drag the darkness out into the light. He looked down at the small, determined boy beside him. Then he looked towards the road that led to Ash Hollow. We're going into town, he said, his voice a quiet declaration of war. Together. Zeke's hand trembled, but he reached out and took Silas's. He held on tight, his small fingers gripping with a strength that came not from fear, but from faith. They rode into Ash Hollow as the sun was climbing a honey-gray sky. Silas sat tall on his mare, his face a mask of grim determination. Zeke clung to him from behind, his arms wrapped tightly around the man's waist. a silent promise he didn't yet have the words to speak. The town was just waking up, but their arrival did not go unnoticed. Men sitting on barrels outside the saloon fell silent. A woman sweeping her porch stopped mid-sweep. Curtains twitched in windows. The town of Ash Hollow held its breath, sensing that the fragile peace, built on years of secrets and lies, was about to be shattered. They didn't speak as they rode down the main street. Silas's eyes were fixed straight ahead. Zeke kept his head down, but his gaze darted from side to side, taking in every face, every shadow. They stopped in front of Maeve's general store. She was waiting for them, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes locked on the small boy behind Silas. "You weren't lying," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. Silas dismounted and helped Zeke down. "Never was. And you brought him here?" "Figured it's time folks stop pretending they don't see what's right in front of them." Maeve crouched down in front of Zeke, her movements slow and gentle. "You hungry, child?" Zeke looked up at Silas, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. The boy turned back to Maeve and nodded. "Then come on inside. I've got day-old bread and peach jam that's never met a better mouth." Zeke followed her into the store. Silas remained outside, one hand resting on his belt, his eyes scanning the street. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew trouble was looking for him. By the time they came back out, a crowd had started to gather. They came slowly, drawn by a morbid curiosity, their faces a mixture of suspicion and fear. And then, from the shadows of the saloon's awning, Luther Ransom appeared. He pushed himself off the post he was leaning against, a wide, predatory smile stretching across his face. "Well now," he called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Ain't this a sweet little parade?" Silas turned to face him, his body a shield in front of Zeke. "You got something to say, Luther? Say it." "I'm just wondering what the law thinks of a man like you keeping a child that don't belong to him." "He don't belong to you either." "Blood says otherwise." "Blood's a lie when it's spilled for pleasure," Silas shot back, his voice cold as steel. Luther's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The tension in the street crackled like a live wire. Every person in that crowd seemed to be holding their breath. Zeke stood frozen beside Silas, his small hand balled into a fist, clutching the fabric of the man's coat. Marshal Boone arrived then, his horse trotting down the street with a false sense of calm. "Grady," he said, his voice heavy with weariness, "what are you hoping to accomplish here? Bringing the boy into town like this?" "Not hiding anymore," Silas replied simply. Boone looked at the crowd, at Luther, and then back at Silas. "There's talk, Grady, about what really happened to the judge's daughter-in-law, about that fire all those years ago that killed your wife. You stir this up, it won't just be gossip anymore." "Good," Silas said. "It's time the fire burned where it was always meant to." Boone sighed and swung down from his horse. He walked over to Zeke and knelt, his face softening for the first time. "You know who I am, son?" Zeke nodded slowly. "You know what'll happen if you speak the truth?" Zeke's mouth was dry. He glanced at Luther, who was smirking with an arrogant confidence. He looked up at Silas, who gave him a small encouraging nod. He looked back at the marshal, and he nodded again. "Then tell me," Boone said softly. "What did he do?" Zeke opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The crowd leaned in, a collective, silent gasp. The boy's hands trembled. He clenched them, unclenched them. And then he found his voice. "He hurt my mama," he said, the words clear and true. "He hurt me, and he told me. He told me no one would ever believe me. He said I'd burn, just like her." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Boone stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on Luther. "Care to answer that, Ransom?" Luther's face hardened. "You going to take the word of a half-starved, lying orphan over me? Over a ransom?" But Zeke's voice rang out again, stronger this time. "He wore a silver ring. He always wore it. He made my mama cry. He locked me in the root cellar when I said I'd tell." A woman in the crowd gasped. The preacher's sister dropped her Bible. Boone's hand fell to the butt of his pistol, a slow, deliberate movement. Luther saw it, and a flicker of panic crossed his face. "You can't be serious, Marshal." "I am. This is slander. You have no proof." "This is enough. a new voice commanded. Judge Ransom had arrived. He stepped through the crowd which parted for him like the Red Sea. His eyes, cold and pale, landed on Silas. I tried to handle this quietly, Grady, the judge said, his voice laced with menace. I thought I owed that much to Clara's memory. You don't get to say her name, Silas snarled. The judge's face contorted with rage. You want to bury another one, Grady? Is that what this is about? But it was Zeke's voice that cut through the tension, small but sharp as a razor. She's already buried, he said, pointing a trembling finger at Luther. He lit the fire. Every head in the street turned to Luther. His face went pale. I didn't. The boy's lying. He said she was weak, Zeke continued, the words pouring out of him now, a torrent of truth that could no longer be contained. He said she wouldn't shut up about what he'd done. He poured kerosene on the floorboards. I saw him. I saw him strike the match. Boone drew his revolver. The metallic click echoed down the silent street. Luther Ransom, he said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. You're under arrest for suspicion of arson and the murders of Sarah Jennings and Clara May Grady. The crowd erupted. The judge stumbled, his face ashen. Luther, trapped and cornered, made a desperate move. He reached for the gun hidden under his coat, but Silas was faster. The shot from his rifle cracked through the air, the sound echoing off the buildings like a clap of thunder. The bullet kicked up the dirt at Luther's feet. It wasn't a kill shot. It was a statement, a warning. It was a declaration that the time for silence was over. Luther froze, his hands shooting into the air. Boone and his deputies swarmed him, wrestling him to the ground. Zeke stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. Silas walked to him and knelt, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. It's done, he said softly. Zeke's lip trembled. Will they believe me now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Silas looked around at the faces in the crowd. He saw shock, he saw confusion, but for the first time he also saw belief. He saw the town of Ash Hollow waking up from a long, dark dream. They do, Silas said. They believe you now. The days that followed the arrest were quiet, like the eerie calm after a violent storm. The wind no longer howled, but the wreckage of the Ransom's reign of terror was everywhere. Zeke spent most of his time at the window of the cabin, wrapped in an old quilt, just watching the world. He was like a soldier on watch, still unable to believe the war was over. Silas let him be. Some wounds, he knew, had to be exposed to the air before they could heal. He cooked simple meals, bacon and beans, and Zeke started to eat, not like a starving animal, but like a boy who believed there would be another meal tomorrow. He started asking questions again, not about the bad things, but about the good. Did Clara like to sing? What was the name of your first horse? Silas answered them all, the memories painful but no longer poisonous. About a week later, Maeve brought news from town. Judge Ransom had fallen ill. A sudden affliction of the chest, they called it. He was leaving Ash Hollow, retiring to a property out in Kansas, where his name didn't carry the stench of murder and corruption. His power, once absolute, had crumbled to dust overnight. The trial's coming for Luther, Maeve told Silas. Too many people are talking now. Too many old stories are bubbling up to the surface. They can't sweep this under the rug. Before she left, Silas handed her a folded piece of paper. Zeke drew this, he said, for the court, said they should see what he remembers. Maeve unfolded it. It was a child's sketch, stark and brutal. A man with a silver ring held a lit match. A woman was curled on the floor, surrounded by rising smoke. Maeve stared at it for a long moment, her eyes filled with tears. That boy, she whispered. He's not just brave. He's a survivor. He's alive, Silas corrected her gently, and for now that's enough. Zeke had started painting again, this time with a fierce, burning purpose. He filled an entire wall of the cabin with his art. He painted the dark woods, the hollow log, the barn glowing with lantern light. And in the corner of one painting, he depicted a small boy holding hands with a man-shaped shadow. You ever think about leaving this place? Zeke asked him one morning as they sat on the fence rail. Used to, Silas admitted. Why didn't you? Didn't have a reason to stay, Silas said, looking out at the valley. But I didn't have a good enough reason to run either. That kind of purgatory, it changes a man. Zeke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to go back. To the log. Silas's hands stilled on the saddle he was mending. Why? I just need to stand there, Zeke said, his voice firm, and not feel scared anymore. So they rode out together, back to the place where their story had begun. Zeke dismounted and walked to the hollow log on his own. He knelt and touched the rough bark, his fingers tracing the patterns. He stayed there for a long time, and then he stood up and turned to Silas, his face resolute. I don't want to be from there anymore, he said. I want to be from here, with you. On the way back, they saw Maeve again. She waved them over and handed Zeke a large parcel wrapped in brown paper. This is for the schoolhouse, she said. Zeke looked confused. What do you mean? The town council took a vote, she explained, a proud smile on her face. We want you to paint something on the front wall, something big, so that when people see it, they'll remember that this town grew a heart. Inside the parcel were brand new brushes and big pots of paint, a rainbow of colors sealed with wax. Zeke stared at them, his eyes wide with disbelief. Everyone else in this town leaves their mark with ugly words and secrets, Maeve said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You, child, you leave yours with color. Zeke started the mural the next morning. At first, it was just broad strokes of blue and green, abstract shapes without meaning. But as the days turned into a week, an image began to emerge. At the center, he painted a massive pine tree, its branches spreading wide like protective arms. Beneath it were the figures of children, men, and women, all faceless but united, standing under a sky that pulsed with the colors of a sunrise. At the edge of the mural, he painted a smaller broken tree, its trunk split in half. But out of that split trunk grew a profusion of wildflowers, bright, defiant, and beautiful. The people of Ash Hollow would stop and watch him work. At first, they kept their distance, but soon they began to linger, offering him a drink of water or a quiet word of encouragement. The town, it seemed, was learning how to witness something beautiful instead of just bearing something ugly. One morning, Marshall Boone approached Silas as he watched Zeke paint. You should know, he said, his voice low. Luther's lawyer filed a motion. They're moving him. Say he's not safe in the county jail. Silas's eyes narrowed. Moved where? Rail car heading east. Could be gone by sunrise tomorrow. The Ransoms still have money. They still have connections. That night, Silas sat by the fire long after Zeke had fallen asleep. He looked at the boy, his small face peaceful in the firelight, and a cold, hard resolve settled in his heart. There was one last thing he had to do. Before dawn, he saddled his mare. Zeke woke as the cabin door creaked open. You leaving? He asked, his voice thick with sleep. Only for a few hours, Silas said. Going to say something I should have said a long time ago. He rode hard through the pre-dawn mist until the county jail rose before him like a tombstone. Boone was waiting outside, a cup of coffee in his hand. He just nodded, as if he'd been expecting him. Luther was sitting in his cell, a bored expression on his face. When he saw Silas, his lips curled into a sneer. Come to watch me go, Grady? Come to see the man who beat you get away with it all? No, Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of years of pain. I came so I could finally sleep again. You think one visit is going to wash away the guilt? You didn't save Clara. You let her burn. You're right, Silas said, stepping closer to the bars. I didn't save her. I'll carry that failure for the rest of my days, but I'm not here to fight you, Luther. I'm here to see what a coward looks like before he disappears into the dark. Luther shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. You don't scare me, old man. You don't have to be scared of me, Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You just have to sit in that train car and know that you didn't win. You have to know that your story, the real one, is now painted on the front of the town you thought you owned. That boy. He painted your soul for everyone to see, and every child who ever walks past that wall will know what evil looks like. They'll know how small and pathetic it really is. He turned and walked away, leaving Luther standing speechless in his cell. As the train rolled into the station an hour later, the sun finally broke through the clouds. A small crowd had gathered on the platform. They didn't shout. They didn't jeer. They just stood and watched as Luther Ransom was loaded into a guarded car. his face turned away from the town he had terrorized for so long. Zeke stood near Maeve, a paintbrush still clutched in his hand. Silas walked up and stood beside him. "Is it over?" Zeke asked, his eyes on the departing train. Silas thought for a moment. He looked at the mural, at the faces of the townspeople, at the small, resilient boy beside him. "No," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think it's just beginning." The mural was finished a few days later. In the bottom corner, Zeke didn't sign his name. He just painted a small, perfect pine cone, its twine retied and strong. Ash Hollow didn't change overnight, but it had started to. The school bell rang every morning. Children played near the creek without fear. And the story of the town was no longer written in whispers and shadows, but in bold, vibrant color on a wall for all to see. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Zeke leaned his head against Silas's shoulder. "I don't feel broken anymore," he said quietly. Silas put his arm around the boy. "You never were." "Do you think Clara would have liked the mural?" Zeke asked, his eyes growing heavy. Silas smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "She wouldn't have just liked it," he said. "She would have helped you paint it." They sat there in the golden quiet of the dusk as the first stars appeared. A man who had found a reason to stay, and a boy who had found his way home. Justice doesn't always arrive with a gavel or a gunshot. Sometimes it comes quietly, with the stroke of a paintbrush in a small, steady hand. And if you ever find yourself in a town that seems to have lost its way, look for the color. Look for the story that refused to be erased, because hope once painted can never truly fade. And if a story like this moves you, if you believe that the courage of one can bring light to the darkest of places, then make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because there are a million stories buried in the shadows, just waiting for someone to be brave enough to tell them.